They bulldozed my great-great-grandmother's 120-year-old magnolia tree while I was at my mother's funeral, and the revenge I got was so sweet it's now featured in 3 law school textbooks. I'm talking about a tree my ancestor planted in 1903 when this land was nothing but desert and dreams. 5 generations of family memories carved into that bark. The morning I'm laying my mom to rest, the HOA chairman decides it's the perfect time to take a chainsaw to our family's living monument. I come home that evening, emotionally shattered, and there he is, Richard Blackwood, standing next to the massacre with a smug grin and a folder full of fabricated emergency orders. The tree looks like someone detonated a bomb next to it. Completely gone, nothing but sawdust and spite. But here's what happens when you destroy something sacred out of pure malice. Sometimes the universe decides to show everyone exactly what kind of monster you really are. What would you do if you returned from your mother's funeral to find your family's heritage erased? Drop a comment and tell me about your HOA nightmares. Let me introduce myself. I'm Marcus Chen, 48 years old, 4th generation carpenter living in the same adobe house my great-great-grandmother built when Arizona was still a territory. It's a 1903 Spanish colonial with thick walls and hand-carved beams where morning light used to filter through 120-year-old magnolia leaves onto my workshop table. The whole place smelled like cedar shavings and machine oil, scents that soak into your bones after a century of honest work. That magnolia outside my kitchen window, my great-great-grandmother planted it with her bare hands in 1903, the year she arrived from Mexico with nothing but determination and carpentry skills that could shame modern contractors. She said she needed something beautiful to remember home while building something new. Every family milestone happened under those massive branches. First communion photos, quinceañera celebrations, my wedding picture from when I still believed promises lasted forever. When Mom got the Alzheimer's diagnosis, she'd sit under that tree every sunset, trying to hold on to memories while the disease slowly stole them away. 18 months of watching the strongest woman I knew forget my name. The divorce papers arrived 6 weeks before her final diagnosis. Turns out my wife couldn't handle, for better or worse, when worse involved medical bills and sleepless nights. So that house, that tree, they weren't just property anymore. They were my last anchor to everything that defined our family. Here's where it gets complicated. This used to be open desert until developers invaded 12 years ago like conquistadors in hard hats. Desert Vista Estates, because nothing screams authentic Southwest like naming your subdivision after the landscape you just destroyed to build it. They surrounded my grandmother's place with cookie-cutter stucco boxes, then decided we all needed an HOA to maintain their investment returns. My property got grandfathered in with voluntary compliance, which is like saying a root canal is voluntary if you enjoy agony. Enter Richard Blackwood, stage left with a briefcase and a Napoleon complex. Moved here from New Jersey 8 years ago, immediately ran for HOA chairman like he was campaigning for supreme dictator. Corporate lawyer naturally. Lives in the biggest house on the block, 2,200 square feet of beige mediocrity where even the doorbell sounds pretentious. The click of his Italian leather shoes on concrete became the neighborhood's unofficial warning system. The harassment started with official notices printed on letterhead that made toilet paper look expensive. My workshop noise violated quiet hours. Apparently using power tools at 2 p.m. on Tuesday is criminal in HOA land. My truck was too large for residential parking, even though it fit in my driveway with room to spare. There's apparently a difference between forest green and sage green that only someone with too much education and too little common sense could detect. But the magnolia became his holy grail. He claimed the canopy extended 18 inches beyond my property line. 18 inches, like he was negotiating international treaties instead of tree branches. I'd had it professionally assessed 8 months earlier, but Richard hired his own arborist and documented every leaf like he was conducting a forensic investigation. The man took measurements from 23 different angles like he was mapping a crime scene. The morning of Mom's funeral, I left before dawn for the service 3 hours away. Left my spare key with Mr. Eduardo, my 79-year-old neighbor who's sharper than a tack and keeps better surveillance on this neighborhood than the CIA. The funeral was everything you'd expect. A pastor reading generic comfort while my sister and I tried to stay composed in black suits that smelled like storage and sorrow. I returned just as the desert sunset was painting the sky in shades of copper and gold, my truck tires crunching on gravel that suddenly sounded deafening in the evening stillness. That's when I saw it. My tree. 5 generations of family history. Completely obliterated like some psychopath's fever dream. Not trimmed, not relocated. Surgically annihilated, leaving nothing but a stump and the smell of fresh sawdust mixed with diesel exhaust hanging in the air like evidence of war crimes. Richard stood there in his perfect 3-piece suit, supervising a cleanup crew with his tablet, while neighbors gathered like spectators at a demolition derby. He waved an emergency work order at me, claiming imminent danger to public safety. I stood there in my funeral clothes, staring at my murdered family tree while neighbors emerged from their houses like prairie dogs after gunfire. That's when I realized this wasn't about property maintenance. This was personal warfare. Richard stood there like he'd just discovered the cure for cancer, brandishing that emergency work order like it was the Bill of Rights itself. 5 neighbors reported dangerous falling branches, he announced loud enough for the growing crowd to hear. The HOA has emergency authority to protect residents from immediate threats. Immediate threats, right. And I'm the Pope. I demanded to see these mysterious complaints. Confidentiality concerns, he replied smoothly, clutching his tablet like it contained state secrets. But Richard couldn't resist showcasing his thoroughness. He documented everything with the obsession of a serial killer keeping trophies. Photos with GPS coordinates, measurements accurate to fractions of inches, contractor estimates for work that cost more than some people's cars. This tree was professionally evaluated 8 months ago, I said, pulling out my phone to show the certified arborist's report. Licensed, bonded, completely legal. He actually chuckled, not a polite laugh, but a condescending snort that sounded like he'd been gargling with concrete. That's adorable, Marcus. File a complaint. The HOA's legal budget could purchase your little house 3 times over. That's when I noticed something interesting happening. While Richard gloated, neighbors were documenting everything with their phones, not just gawking, but sharing. The magnolia stump was spreading across social media faster than gossip at a barber shop. Some people were genuinely outraged, called it cultural vandalism and deliberately vindictive. The stump looked like something from a war documentary, and apparently that was Instagram gold. Richard, being Richard, decided to weaponize the attention. This proves how hazardous it was, he declared to the growing audience of camera phones. Look at all these people gathering around a safety hazard. It was clearly a public distraction. I spent that night researching property law until my eyes burned like I'd been staring at welding flames. Mom had been a union organizer before retirement, taught me that knowledge is the only weapon bureaucrats can't confiscate. Turns out I'd remembered correctly that emergency powers aren't quite as emergency as dictators pretend. Something about notification requirements, proper procedures, documentation deadlines. Digging deeper into municipal websites, I found exactly what I needed. HOA Emergency Authority requires 48-hour written notice for any non-life-threatening work. The only exception is if someone's literally dying in the next 5 minutes. A tree that survived World War I doesn't suddenly become lethal on funeral day. The next morning, I called the HOA's attorney. Voicemail, called again. More voicemail. Apparently, emergency work doesn't include returning calls from people you're screwing over. That's when Mr. Eduardo shuffled over with news that made my coffee taste like celebration. He'd witnessed Richard measuring my tree at 6:30 a.m. the day of Mom's funeral. 4 hours before any emergency documentation existed, 8 hours before the chainsaws started their destruction symphony. He had that little measuring tape out there like he was planning a heist, Mr. Eduardo said, his voice carrying that special tone elderly Mexican men reserve for calling out premium-grade bullshit. Took pictures from every direction. That man orchestrated this whole operation like a military campaign. But here's where it got beautiful. Mr. Eduardo has surveillance cameras, professional-grade security systems because he got tired of package thieves stealing his heart medication. Those cameras captured Richard red-handed, measuring and photographing my tree hours before filing any emergency paperwork. Emergency my weathered ass, Mr. Eduardo muttered, handing me a memory card that felt like pure platinum. That guy's about as emergency as a scheduled dentist appointment. The footage was magnificent. Timestamp, 6:47 a.m. There's Richard measuring my magnolia with the dedication of a forensic investigator. Emergency work order filing time, 1:23 p.m. Work commenced, 10:15 a.m. The mathematics were simple enough for a preschooler. You can't file emergency documentation after you've already started the emergency work. The sound of car engines became our new neighborhood soundtrack as curiosity seekers discovered our accidental memorial site. Professional photographers appeared with equipment worth more than my workshop. Local coffee shops started advertising Heritage Blend specials and Magnolia Memorial pastries. The regional newspaper ran a feature story about suburban environmental destruction. Richard doubled down harder than a desperate gambler. He told anyone with a microphone that the tree's posthumous fame proved it had been a dangerous attraction and liability catastrophe. In his twisted reasoning, people wanting to photograph something meaningful meant it needed to be completely eliminated. But he miscalculated spectacularly. The internet has perfect memory and zero tolerance for petty tyrants. Every HOA horror story in the state started circulating alongside photos of my stump. People shared their own Richard encounters. The elderly couple he harassed for flying a Mexican flag that was supposedly 3 inches too large. the disabled veteran he cited for installing a wheelchair ramp without architectural approval. That evening, I sat where my family tree used to stand, watching sunset light illuminate empty space where 5 generations of memories had grown, and realized something crucial. Richard thought he was teaching me a lesson about compliance. Instead, he'd just provided a masterclass in how sociopaths reveal themselves when they believe nobody's documenting their crimes. Game on. 4 days later, my mailbox delivered Christmas in legal form. Court documents thick enough to stop bullets. The HOA's law firm had crafted a cease and desist letter that read like a declaration of total war, complete with embossed letterhead and language threatening harassment and character assassination charges. Character assassination from a man who destroys heritage trees during funerals. The irony could have powered Las Vegas for a month. But Richard wasn't finished playing amateur prosecutor. He'd compiled an encyclopedia of violations. My workshop tools, commercial equipment in residential zones. My truck, still allegedly too large. My weekend construction projects, excessive noise disturbing suburban tranquility. Each violation came with escalating daily penalties because nothing says community leadership like financially torturing your neighbors into submission. Here's where his brilliant strategy hit a crater the size of the Grand Canyon. My obliterated magnolia was becoming a legitimate historical landmark. Not just neighborhood famous, state famous. Documentary crews started arriving. The Arizona Historical Society added it to their Sites of Cultural Significance database right between ancient petroglyphs and a ghost town that charges admission. The aroma of diesel exhaust from documentary equipment trucks mixed with desert heat and sunscreen became our permanent atmosphere. Mrs. Patterson started charging film crews $10 to use her facilities and was earning more than most people's day jobs. The Johnson family established a Memorial Garden supply stand that could have funded a small nonprofit. Even the perpetually antisocial teenagers across the street were selling overpriced energy drinks to photographers with more equipment than sense. That's when Richard deployed his next power play, contacting code enforcement about my unauthorized commercial operation. Never mind that I wasn't charging anyone or controlling who arrived with cameras. In Richard's universe, logic was an optional accessory. Mr. Chen, Officer Martinez said, consulting a citation pad that looked suspiciously similar to Richard's favorite prop. You need to discourage commercial activity or face zoning violations. I was preparing to argue when Mr. Eduardo materialized like an elderly Mexican guardian angel with intelligence that changed everything. He'd been conducting his own investigation, bless his detective instincts, and discovered something spectacular. Richard's law firm owned the demolition company that had destroyed my magnolia. $4,100 for 6 hours' work, Mr. Eduardo announced, brandishing printed corporate records like he'd uncovered buried treasure. No competitive bids, no board approval, just Richard writing checks to himself. That evening, while researching HOA financial regulations online, because insomnia and righteous fury make excellent research companions, I stumbled across something my carpenter's brain should have recognized immediately. Emergency expenditures exceeding $1,000 require board authorization and competitive bidding. Always and no exceptions, even for genuine emergencies. I called Sofia Ramirez the next morning. She'd already heard about the magnolia through legal professional networks. Apparently, chainsawing heritage trees during funerals creates quite the discussion in attorney circles. He paid his own company $4,000 without board approval? Sophia asked, and I could practically hear her grinning through the phone. That's not just procedural violation, that's textbook embezzlement. While I was building my case, Richard launched his character destruction campaign. Anonymous complaints about my carpentry work started materializing at client sites like termites after rain. Safety inspections that mysteriously coincided with every social media post about the magnolia situation. Whispered insinuations that I was unstable since Mom's death, using grief as justification to harass innocent board members. The psychological warfare felt like death by 1,000 bureaucratic paper cuts. Neighbors who used to chat started discovering urgent lawn maintenance whenever I appeared. Mrs. Gonzalez, who'd brought me tamales during Mom's final months, suddenly developed pressing indoor projects when I drove by. Then came the anonymous messages. Cheap drugstore paper with threats scrawled in block letters that looked like a fourth grader's handwriting. Drop the investigation or things escalate. Trees aren't the only things that disappear. Intelligent people recognize when to surrender. I found them everywhere, under windshield wipers shoved through my mail slot, even duct taped to my workshop door. The paper felt rough and cheap, the kind that gives you cuts if you handle it carelessly. Whoever was composing these masterpieces was either incredibly stupid or desperately panicked. But Richard's masterstroke came when Channel 12 decided to produce an investigative segment called HOA Accountability When Authority Goes Wrong. He couldn't resist the spotlight, agreeing to an on-camera interview wearing his finest power suit and practiced community leader expression. The reporter questioned the timing. Kabatsum, why emergency powers were essential on the exact day of my mother's funeral. Richard's response was a symphony of bureaucratic nonsense about unfortunate coincidences and safety priorities superseding personal scheduling conflicts. Personal scheduling conflicts. He just called my mother's funeral a scheduling conflict on live television. That night, watching the interview replay online, I realized Richard had just handed me the smoking gun I needed. Because there's one thing bullies can't survive: having their cruelty broadcast to thousands of people who understand the difference between emergency tree removal and calculated revenge. The comment section was already exploding like the 4th of July, and none of it was friendly to Richard. The morning after Richard's television catastrophe, he called an emergency HOA board meeting. Not the usual monthly gathering where 4 people show up to debate parking regulations, a full-blown emergency session with certified notices and everything. The agenda declaring my property a continuing public nuisance and authorizing complete landscaping correction. He'd learned absolutely nothing from the interview backlash. Zero. The man had the self-awareness of a parking meter. The meeting was scheduled for Tuesday evening at the community center, one of those tan buildings that looks like it was designed by someone who'd surrendered to mediocrity. Fluorescent lighting that made everyone appear deceased, folding chairs that protested every movement, and the lingering odor of industrial cleaner mixed with shattered expectations. Richard had done his preparation this time, mobilizing supporters with military precision. He brought in a certified landscape engineer to testify about soil instability and insurance liability, had documentation about property values being damaged by uncontrolled visitor traffic, even produced a petition with 42 signatures demanding immediate action. The landscape engineer, a guy who looked like he'd rather be performing root canals, testified that the remaining stump was compromised and could cause foundation damage. Never mind that my certified soil engineer had already submitted analysis declaring it structurally irrelevant. Richard's expert wore a suit and had laminated charts, so obviously he was more credible, but I'd been preparing too. That morning, I'd visited the county records office and retrieved the original land grant from 1903. Sometimes the best defense against modern bureaucracy is older bureaucracy. And boy, did I strike gold. The grant contained a cultural preservation clause requiring protection of significant mature flora on the property. Not just any vegetation, specifically mature specimens. And my magnolia was explicitly documented by the territorial surveyor as a heritage tree estimated 120 plus years to be preserved in perpetuity. In perpetuity. That's legal language for forever, you power-hungry briefcase warrior. Sophia had driven up from Tucson for the meeting, armed with copies of the land grant and a briefcase full of legal precedents. She looked like the kind of attorney who actually understood constitutional law instead of just using law books as expensive doorstops. The kind who could make opposing counsel reconsider their career choices with a politely worded motion. The community center filled like a championship boxing match. Richard's supporters clustered near the front, mostly newcomers who'd bought into his property values propaganda. My supporters distributed throughout the room, longtime residents, people who remembered when this was open desert, documentary filmmakers who'd driven down specifically for the meeting after seeing the news coverage. Mr. Eduardo had positioned himself front and center, armed with a folder thick enough to stop small-caliber bullets. He'd spent the week documenting every procedural violation, every financial irregularity, every abuse of authority Richard had committed since assuming office. The man had transformed HOA oversight into performance art. Richard called the meeting to order with all the authority of someone who'd binged too many legal dramas. He presented his case like a district attorney, complete with charts displaying declining property values and traffic disruption data that would have impressed a statistician. "This stump has become a media circus," he declared, gesturing toward enlarged photographs of tourists taking selfies. "Property values are declining. Families can't enjoy their yards safely. Decisive action must be taken." That's when Sophia stood up, briefcase in hand, like she was preparing to perform legal surgery. "Before this board votes on anything," she said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that makes people straighten their posture, "I'd like to present some documentation that might fascinate everyone." She extracted the land grant like a magician, revealing the ace of spades. "This magnolia is protected under the original cultural preservation covenant attached to this property. Any destruction requires state permits, environmental impact assessments, and approval from the Tribal Cultural Committee." The room achieved silence so complete you could hear the fluorescent bulbs humming their death song. Richard's face cycled through more colors than a traffic light having a seizure. Furthermore, Sophia continued, clearly savoring the moment, the emergency tree destruction was performed without proper permits, violating state ordinances and federal environmental protection statutes. The contractor who performed this work could face felony charges for destruction of protected cultural heritage. Richard's landscape engineer suddenly developed intense fascination with his shoes. The contractor in question happened to be sitting 5 rows back, and he looked like he'd rather be swimming with piranhas than sitting in that room. But Sophia wasn't finished. The HOA also violated its own financial procedures by awarding a no-bid contract worth $4,000 to a board member's business without proper authorization. That's not just procedural violation, it's potential embezzlement under federal law. The silence stretched like taffy until someone in the back started slow clapping. Then others joined. Within 30 seconds, half the room was applauding while Richard sat there looking like he'd been struck by lightning carrying legal documents. That's when I realized we'd just transitioned from playing defense to full-scale offensive warfare. Richard thought he was conducting a public execution. Instead, he'd just provided the rope for his own legal hanging. The vote was postponed indefinitely. 4 board members quietly submitted resignations during the 15-minute recess. And Richard, he sat in that folding chair, staring at the land grant that had just obliterated his master plan, finally understanding what checkmate looks like. The real breakthrough came 5 days later when Sophia's legal team completed their forensic dive into the HOA's financial records. What they discovered made Richard's tree massacre look like a parking ticket compared to organized crime. "Marcus," Sophia said over the phone, her voice carrying that particular excitement attorneys get when they smell federal charges in the water. "You need to sit down for this. Your magnolia wasn't random revenge. It was desperate evidence destruction. Turns out the original 1903 Territorial Development Agreement contained a cultural protection clause that made my property essentially sacred ground. Any significant mature flora over 75 years old was protected by state ordinance requiring environmental impact studies and tribal consultation for removal. The magnolia was specifically mentioned by name in the surveyor's documentation as a heritage specimen requiring perpetual preservation. Perpetual, as in forever, as in even the governor himself would need permits from 4 different agencies to touch that tree. But here's the part that made my coffee taste like Christmas morning. Richard knew. He'd known for months. The HOA's insurance carrier had flagged the cultural liability during their annual policy review. Any damage to protected heritage could result in criminal charges and civil penalties up to $75,000. He wasn't enforcing HOA regulations. He was eliminating evidence before the insurance audit discovered the violation. The financial smoking gun was even more beautiful. Sophia's forensic accountant had traced a pattern of self-dealing contracts spanning 4 years. $63,000 in HOA funds paid to companies owned by Richard's law firm, his brother's demolition business, his cousin's security company, even his unemployed son's consulting firm that existed only on paper. Richard hadn't just been power tripping. He'd been embezzling HOA funds through family businesses, and the insurance audit was approaching discovery of the entire operation. My magnolia was supposed to be destroyed before anyone could prove it was protected, eliminating the liability that would trigger a comprehensive financial investigation. The tree cutting wasn't personal, Sophia explained, though I could hear papers rustling as she organized evidence. It was criminal. He needed that tree gone before the audit exposed his embezzlement scheme. Mr. Eduardo had provided the final puzzle piece, security footage showing Richard meeting with the demolition crew 3 weeks before Mom's funeral, not discussing emergency tree removal, planning it. The timestamp showed him distributing cash payments, no checks, no official HOA documentation. The insurance company's preliminary audit had already identified financial irregularities requiring immediate federal investigation. Richard's law license was under review by the state bar for conflicts of interest. His wife had quietly filed for divorce the previous month, probably attempting to protect her assets from the incoming legal tsunami. Everything suddenly crystallized. The harassment campaign wasn't about workshop noise or truck size. It was about forcing me out before I could discover the cultural protections on my property. The emergency tree destruction wasn't spite, it was evidence elimination. The anonymous threats weren't intimidation tactics, they were panic. Richard wasn't a petty neighborhood dictator, he was a desperate criminal caught embezzling who was trying to destroy evidence before the federal agents arrived to count the missing money. "How much trouble is he facing?" I asked. Sophia's laugh could have powered a small city. Federal charges for embezzlement, fraud, and destruction of protected cultural property, civil liability for restoration costs, punitive damages, and legal fees, professional sanctions that'll cost his law license, and personal bankruptcy when his wife's divorce attorneys finish with him. The man who thought he was teaching me a lesson about HOA compliance was about to receive a graduate education in consequences. In perfect irony, if he'd simply left my magnolia alone, none of this would have surfaced. His own greed and desperation had created the investigation that would destroy him. Sometimes karma doesn't just arrive, it backs up an 18-wheeler and runs you over repeatedly for emphasis. Sophia's office smelled like leather-bound case law and the kind of espresso that cost more per pound than most people's car insurance. We strategized across her conference table like generals planning D-Day, except instead of storming beaches, we were preparing to obliterate a suburban embezzlement network. Three-pronged assault, Sophia explained, spreading out legal documents that looked like they'd been through a shredder and reconstructed by someone with obsessive-compulsive disorder. Criminal charges, civil lawsuit, and HOA governance reform. We attack from every possible direction until he runs out of places to hide. The criminal case was already constructing itself. The federal prosecutor's office had opened a formal investigation after Sophia provided financial records showing the pattern of fraudulent contracts, embezzlement, environmental destruction, filing false emergency reports. Richard was facing more charges than a mafia accountant, but the civil lawsuit was where we'd really make him suffer. Property damage for the magnolia destruction, punitive damages for the illegal emergency action, emotional distress for timing it during Mom's funeral, plus legal fees that were climbing faster than a SpaceX rocket. Conservative estimate, $95,000, and that was before we calculated pain and suffering. The beauty of this, Sophia said, spreading financial documents like she was dealing poker cards, is that his insurance company will abandon him completely. Embezzlement voids coverage, so they'll pay us generously to avoid defending his criminal activity. Mr. Eduardo had evolved into our unofficial intelligence commander, documenting every HOA procedure Richard had violated over the past 4 years. The man had transformed record-keeping into fine art. Every email, every meeting transcript, every financial transaction organized in color-coded binders that would make the Pentagon jealous. He approved 23 no-bid contracts, Mr. Eduardo reported, adjusting his reading glasses like a scholar examining ancient manuscripts. Total value, $63,400, all to family businesses, all without board approval. The Tribal Cultural Committee had provided expert testimony about the magnolia's significance, complete with documentation dating to 1903. They'd located newspaper articles about my great-great-grandmother's arrival from Mexico, territorial surveys showing the original planting, even aerial photographs from the 1920s proving the tree predated every other structure in 3 counties. I'd absorbed more about property law in 3 weeks than most people learn in a lifetime. Emergency powers require written documentation within 12 hours. Richard had filed his 4 days late. Cultural protection clauses supersede HOA authority. Always, no exceptions. Insurance subrogation means the insurance company becomes your legal ally when they're pursuing reimbursement from criminals. The most satisfying part was watching Richard's support network disintegrate like a sandcastle in a tsunami. 4 board members had already resigned rather than face potential criminal liability. His landscape engineer had hired personal counsel and was cooperating with federal investigators. Even his brother-in-law was sacrificing him to save himself, claiming he'd been deceived about the legality of the tree destruction. My insurance company had transformed into unexpected allies, pursuing their own investigation into the fraudulent emergency claim. Their forensic accountant was documenting every financial irregularity, every procedural violation, every abuse of authority. When insurance companies detect fraud, they become more aggressive than sharks during feeding frenzy. The media attention was building momentum like an avalanche gaining speed. The regional newspaper was planning an investigative series on HOA accountability. Channel 12 was preparing a follow-up story about the federal charges. Even a documentary filmmaker from Los Angeles had contacted me about turning the whole situation into a feature about suburban corruption. I'd enrolled in a public speaking workshop at the community college. Figured if I was going to testify in federal court, I might as well sound like I understood what I was discussing. Learned how to remain calm under hostile cross-examination, how to present evidence clearly, how to make complex legal concepts understandable to ordinary people. The personal preparation was harder than the legal aspects. Reviewing family photographs to document the magnolia's significance meant reliving decades of memories. Pictures of Mom as a child climbing those branches. My quinceañera photos under the canopy. 5 generations of family gatherings, birthday celebrations, graduation parties, all centered around that magnolia tree. The timing was critical. We coordinated the criminal referral with the civil lawsuit filing, planned the media investigation to coincide with the city council hearing on heritage tree designation. Everything would strike simultaneously, creating a perfect storm of legal and public pressure that would make Richard's existence more complicated than quantum mechanics. Sophia had prepared contingency strategies for every conceivable scenario. If criminal charges didn't materialize, we had alternative legal theories. If the civil case stalled, we had backup approaches. If Richard attempted to flee jurisdiction, we had asset protection measures in place. But my favorite element of the entire strategy was the simplest. We were going to allow Richard to destroy himself. Every desperate maneuver he made created additional evidence. Every lie he told was recorded and documented. Every threat just added to the criminal charges. The best part about fighting criminals, Sophia said, organizing her briefcase with the satisfaction of someone who just designed the perfect legal trap, is that they always believe they're more intelligent than they actually are. Richard's going to keep digging until he reaches the Earth's core. Game time was approaching, and we were prepared for total war. Richard's opening move after the financial records went public was hiring Thornton McKenzie and Associates, the kind of law firm that charges more per hour than most people earn in a month. Their downtown Phoenix office featured marble floors so polished you could perform surgery on them and administrative staff who looked like they'd been recruited from fashion magazines. His strategy was elementary: challenge everything. The heritage tree designation, the financial audit findings, even the validity of my land grant. If you can't win on facts, drown the opposition in paperwork and legal expenses. Classic scorched earth tactics from someone who'd rather incinerate the neighborhood than admit he was wrong. But hiring expensive attorneys when you're under investigation for embezzlement sends a specific message to prosecutors. Specifically, the message that you've got money hidden somewhere and aren't planning to cooperate. The federal prosecutor's office upgraded his case to a felony investigation faster than you could say flight risk. That's when the real psychological warfare commenced. Anonymous flyers started appearing on car windshields throughout the neighborhood, claiming I was exploiting my mother's death for financial gain and destroying property values with frivolous litigation. The paper felt cheap and rough like dollar store copy paper and smelled faintly of desperation and off-brand ink. Someone, completely coincidentally I'm sure, kept contacting code enforcement about imaginary violations at my property. Workshop allegedly too noisy, truck parked illegally, suspicious electrical work happening without permits. Each complaint required an official inspection, each inspection wasted a day of my time, and each report concluded with finding no violations whatsoever. The harassment escalated to sabotage when I discovered my workshop's power tools vandalized in the Home Depot parking lot. 4 expensive saws damaged with surgical precision, destroyed like my faith in suburban civility. The security cameras had mysteriously malfunctioned during the exact 15-minute window when the damage occurred. What are the statistical probabilities? Mr. Eduardo's security system, however, had been functioning perfectly. His cameras captured a figure in dark clothing prowling around my property at 2:45 a.m., carrying what appeared suspiciously like demolition tools. The timestamp showed Wednesday night, the same night someone had attempted to finish what Richard started by taking power tools to what remained of my magnolia's root system. The would-be stump assassin had lost courage after making several test cuts, probably realizing that destroying evidence under federal investigation might not be the most intelligent career decision, but they left behind fresh wood chips mixed with hydraulic fluid and the kind of gasoline smell that lingers on tools stored in hot garages. The police investigation focused on anyone with demolition equipment access and motivation to protect Richard. That narrowed the suspect list to approximately 4 people, all of whom happened to be related to the man who'd already demonstrated his willingness to commit crimes involving chainsaws and heritage trees. Richard's media strategy backfired more spectacularly than a defective firework. He gave a tearful interview to Channel 12 about being persecuted by a grief-stricken man seeking revenge, complete with manufactured tears and claims about receiving death threats from outside agitators. The performance would have won acting awards if it hadn't been so transparently rehearsed. But investigative journalists are like bloodhounds. Once they detect a story, they don't stop pursuing. Channel 12's follow-up piece revealed Richard's pattern of targeting homeowners who challenged his authority. 4 families had sold their properties and relocated rather than fight his harassment campaigns. 3 elderly residents had been cited for violations that didn't actually exist in the HOA handbook. The newspaper's legal columnist published a devastating piece about HOA board corruption, using Richard as the poster child for everything dysfunctional about suburban governance. When elected officials believe they're above accountability, the article concluded, homeowners become prisoners in their own communities. My insurance company's investigation had uncovered something magnificent, a pattern of fraudulent insurance claims filed by Richard's family businesses over the past 6 years. Fabricated storm damage, exaggerated vandalism reports, even a suspicious theft of demolition equipment that was mysteriously recovered 2 weeks after the insurance payment cleared. The FBI, actual federal agents with badges and everything, appeared at Richard's house on a Friday morning with search warrants for his financial records. Turns out using HOA funds to pay phantom contractors might qualify as wire fraud when the payments go through electronic banking systems. Federal charges carry longer sentences than state charges, and federal prosecutors don't negotiate as generously as local district attorneys. That evening, I sat where my family magnolia used to thrive, watching sunset light illuminate the space where 5 generations of memories had grown. listening to the sound of Richard's perfectly constructed world collapsing like a house of cards in a hurricane. His expensive attorneys were about to discover that defending embezzlement cases becomes exponentially more difficult when your client keeps committing additional crimes during the investigation. He'd initiated this conflict thinking he was swatting an insect. Instead, he'd provoked a grizzly bear that was about to demonstrate why bears are apex predators, and insects usually survive longer than people who threaten their cubs. The next phase was going to be even more entertaining. Richard's final gambit was so desperate it would have been comedic if it hadn't been so pathetic. He called an emergency meeting to declare the HOA insolvent and dissolve the board entirely, hoping to transfer all assets to a shell corporation before the federal investigation could seize them. His plan had all the sophistication of a child hiding candy by eating the evidence. The meeting notice arrived on a Thursday for a Friday morning session. Technically legal, but obviously designed to minimize attendance. He'd scheduled it for 6:30 a.m. at the community center, banking on most homeowners being either at work or getting children ready for school. Classic authoritarian tactics, change the rules when nobody's watching. But news travels at light speed in neighborhoods where someone's been committing crimes with power tools. By Thursday night, social media was exploding with meeting details and calls for maximum attendance. Mr. Eduardo had organized a communication network more efficient than NASA's mission control. Friday morning arrived with the kind of desert heat that makes concrete soft and patience thinner. The community center parking lot resembled a political convention, packed with cars, work trucks, and at least 4 news vans with satellite dishes pointed skyward like mechanical cacti. Inside, Richard sat at the head table, looking like he'd aged 15 years in 3 weeks. His signature 3-piece suit was creased, his usually immaculate hair showed silver roots, and his hands trembled slightly as he shuffled through documents that probably contained more fiction than the public library. Due to escalating legal costs and malicious lawsuits, he announced to a crowd that filled every seat and lined the walls, the board has no alternative but to declare insolvency and dissolve this HOA. The audience reaction was immediate and volcanic. Shouts of "Show us the books" and "Where's our money" echoed off the walls while Richard banged his gavel like he was driving railroad spikes. The smell of too many people in too small a space mixed with nervous perspiration and the industrial disinfectant that never quite masked the building's underlying mustiness. That's when Sophia stood up from the back row, briefcase in hand and wearing the kind of smile that makes defense attorneys reach for stomach medication. "Before this board takes any action," she said, her voice slicing through the chaos like a blade through silk, "I have some documents that might interest everyone." She walked to the front with the measured pace of someone who knows she holds all the winning cards. "Mr. Blackwood, you're served." The papers hit the table with a satisfying impact that seemed to reverberate in the sudden silence. Federal charges for embezzlement, fraud, and destruction of protected cultural property, civil lawsuit for damages exceeding $95,000, and a federal investigation into wire fraud and racketeering. Richard's face went through more color changes than a desert sunset. White to red to green and back to white, like someone was controlling his complexion with a remote. Furthermore, Sophia continued, clearly relishing the performance, "Any attempt to dissolve this HOA or transfer assets while under federal investigation constitutes obstruction of justice and tampering with evidence. I've already filed injunctions preventing any such actions." The FBI agents who'd been sitting quietly in the back row suddenly became very interesting to everyone in the room. They'd been documenting Richard's bankruptcy scheme in real time, adding witness tampering and obstruction charges to his growing collection of felonies. But the most beautiful moment came when Detective Morales from the county sheriff's department approached the head table with handcuffs that gleamed under the fluorescent lights. "Richard Blackwood, you're under arrest for embezzlement of public funds, filing false emergency reports, and destruction of protected cultural resources." The sound of those handcuffs clicking shut was sweeter than mariachi music on Christmas morning. Richard's carefully constructed facade crumbled completely as he was led out in restraints, his expensive lawyers scrambling behind him like confused puppies following a fire truck. The room erupted in applause that lasted 2 full minutes. Cameras flashed, phones recorded, and somewhere in the chaos, Mr. Eduardo was high-fiving people half his age while clutching a folder full of evidence that had helped bring down a neighborhood tyrant. The remaining board members, what was left after the resignations, voted unanimously to cooperate fully with all investigations and implement transparent financial procedures. The bankruptcy motion died faster than a vampire at sunrise, and emergency audits were scheduled for the following week. Outside the community center, reporters swarmed like bees around spilled nectar. The questions came rapid and predictable. How did it feel to see justice served? What would happen to the memorial site? Was this really about HOA overreach or something larger? I kept my answers straightforward and let Sophia handle the legal complexities. But when one reporter asked what I'd learned from the entire experience, I gave them the soundbite that would play on news broadcasts for weeks. I learned that bullies depend on good people staying silent. The moment you illuminate their behavior, they scatter like cockroaches when you flip on the kitchen light. That evening, sitting where my magnolia used to cast shade, with a beer and the satisfaction of watching karma deliver a masterclass in consequences, I realized something profound. This hadn't just been about saving my family's heritage. It had been about proving that ordinary people can fight corruption and win, even when the system seems rigged against them. Sometimes David doesn't just defeat Goliath, he gets him arrested for tax evasion too. The federal court hearing was scheduled for Monday morning, and by 8 a.m. the chambers were packed tighter than a subway car during rush hour. Media crews had established equipment that resembled a television studio, complete with lighting arrays and enough cables to power a shopping mall. The smell of nervous anticipation mixed with anxiety hung in the air like humidity before a thunderstorm. Richard sat in the defendant's section wearing an orange jumpsuit that clashed horribly with his complexion. Apparently, federal detention doesn't offer wardrobe consultations. He'd been released on bail that weekend, just in time to watch his empire collapse in front of half the state's population and 5 news stations. The Tribal Cultural Committee presented first, armed with documentation that would have impressed the National Archives. Photographs dating to 1905, territorial surveys showing the magnolia's protected status, even soil samples proving its age and ecological significance. The presenter, a retired professor who looked like he'd stepped from a history documentary, spoke with the kind of authority that makes politicians nervous. "This magnolia represents not just botanical heritage," he explained, gesturing toward enlarged photographs showing my great-great-grandmother planting the sapling, "but the cultural history of this entire region. Destroying it was equivalent to vandalizing a natural cathedral." The certified arborist testified next, explaining how memorial gardens could honor the destroyed heritage while creating something beautiful from tragedy. His presentation included restoration timelines, memorial design concepts, and community healing strategies that transform destruction into renewal. That's when the federal prosecutor's representative dropped the bombshell that made Richard's face go whiter than fresh cotton. Mr. Blackwood has been formally charged with 8 felonies, including embezzlement of public funds, environmental destruction, and conspiracy to commit fraud. The federal investigation has uncovered additional evidence of wire fraud and tax evasion spanning multiple years. The room achieved silence so complete you could hear people's heartbeats. Richard's expensive lawyer, the one who probably charged more per hour than most people's annual salaries, looked like he'd rather be anywhere else in the universe, including the surface of Venus during a solar storm. But the real fireworks started when Judge Martinez asked Richard if he had anything to say in his defense. The man who'd terrorized an entire neighborhood with briefcases and fabricated emergencies stood up, still bearing those handcuff marks on his wrists like shameful jewelry, and proceeded to experience what can only be described as a complete public psychological breakdown. "This is a conspiracy," he screamed, his voice cracking like a teenager whose parents discovered his search history. "That tree was hazardous. I was protecting the community. These people are just envious of effective leadership." He ranted for 12 minutes about conspiracy theories involving the media, the insurance companies, and somehow the federal government. Apparently, everyone was targeting him because he understood property management better than the sheep he'd been trying to protect. The bailiffs started moving toward him when he began pointing accusingly at random audience members, claiming they were paid protesters and outside agitators. The irony of a New Jersey transplant calling longtime Arizona residents outsiders was apparently lost on him, but it wasn't lost on the crowd. That's when I stood up. The room fell silent except for the quiet whir of news cameras turning to capture whatever was about to happen. Richard was still ranting about persecution and unfair treatment when I approached the microphone the court clerk offered me. "Mr. Blackwood," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the chamber's sound system, "you destroyed my family's 120-year-old magnolia while I was burying my mother. You embezzled money from neighbors who trusted you. You filed false emergency reports and threatened people who questioned your authority." I paused, looking directly at him while he stood there shaking with rage and whatever remained of his dignity. This was never about tree maintenance or property values. This was about power and what happens when small people get a little authority and forget they're still accountable to the community they claim to serve. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity but was probably only 15 seconds. Then someone in the back started clapping, slowly at first, then others joined until the entire courtroom was applauding so loudly the judge had to bang his gavel to restore order. The verdict was unanimous. Heritage Memorial designation approved, protective covenant established, and a small cultural park authorized around the former tree site. The The federal attorney announced that criminal charges would proceed regardless of the HOA's financial status, and that complete restitution would be required before any plea agreements could be considered. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded me like I'd just won the Nobel Prize or discovered cold fusion. The questions came rapidly. How did it feel to win? What's next for the memorial? Any advice for other homeowners fighting HOA corruption? My answer became the soundbite that played on every news broadcast that night. This was never about winning or losing. It was about remembering that in America, your neighbor can't erase your family's history just because they don't like your workshop hours. Sometimes you have to fight for what's right, even when fighting seems impossible. 8 months later, my Magnolia Memorial had become the most visited cultural site in 4 counties, complete with historical markers and a small museum run by volunteers who donated proceeds to heritage preservation programs. The irony was delicious. Richard's attempt to eliminate my family's legacy had transformed it into a symbol of community resistance that brought thousands of visitors and over $75,000 annually to local businesses. The legal aftermath exceeded Sophia's most optimistic predictions. Richard pleaded guilty to avoid a trial that would have been broadcast on court TV, receiving 24 months in federal prison plus complete restitution. His law license was permanently revoked. His wife's divorce was finalized with extreme prejudice, and he was banned from serving on any HOA board for life, assuming he could afford to live anywhere with an HOA after repaying $89,000 in stolen funds and legal fees. The HOA transformation was even more satisfying. New board members were elected on a platform of transparency and accountability, with bylaws rewritten to require competitive bidding for all expenditures over $250 and homeowner approval for any emergency actions. The community that had once lived in fear of briefcase-wielding bureaucrats now had actual democracy, complete with monthly meetings where people debated important issues like playground safety instead of workshop noise. My personal life had taken an unexpected turn for the better. Maria Eduardo, Mr. Eduardo's daughter and a coordinator for the Cultural Preservation Society, had become a regular presence at my kitchen table, helping plan the annual Heritage Memorial Festival while we shared coffee and stories about family legacies worth defending. She had her father's sharp intelligence and her mother's stubborn streak, plus a laugh that made even Monday mornings feel better. The Memorial Restoration Project became a case study at the local community college's environmental program, with students learning about cultural preservation while contributing to its maintenance. The former tree site had developed into a meditation garden more meaningful than anything nature had originally planned, somehow more beautiful for having survived human cruelty. Local schools organized field trips to the memorial, using the site to teach lessons about history, environmental protection, and civic engagement. Children who'd never heard of HOAs learned about standing up to bullies and fighting for what's right, even when the fight seems impossible. Some lessons are worth learning early. The ripple effects spread beyond our little neighborhood. Sophia used our legal precedents to win 5 similar cases across the region, establishing protections for homeowners that saved thousands of people from petty tyranny disguised as community leadership. The state legislature passed HOA reform legislation requiring financial transparency and limiting emergency powers, reforms that wouldn't have existed without Richard's spectacular demonstration of why such laws were necessary. My carpentry business flourished from the publicity and community connections. But more importantly, I'd rediscovered something I didn't know I'd lost during Mom's illness and the divorce: purpose. Speaking at property rights conferences about homeowner advocacy and legal resistance became a part-time calling, helping other people navigate the system when their neighbors decided to play dictator. The annual Heritage Memorial Festival became a celebration of everything Richard had tried to destroy: community spirit, individual rights, and the idea that ordinary people can fight corruption and win. Local musicians performed at the memorial site, artists displayed works inspired by its story, and families gathered for celebrations that recreated the generations of memories that had happened in that same location. 5 generations of family photos now included the memorial as a symbol of resilience rather than loss. Mom would have loved the irony, her funeral becoming the catalyst for a fight that saved her grandmother's legacy and exposed a criminal who'd been stealing from the community for years. Sometimes the best revenge is simply letting bullies destroy themselves while you document the evidence. The final statistics tell the story better than any legal brief. Total recovery, including punitive damages, $127,000. Community economic impact from heritage tourism, over $300,000. HOA reform laws passed using our case precedent, 15 states. Similar cases successfully resolved using our legal strategies, 34 and counting. But the most important number is still one family heritage saved for future generations, standing as proof that sometimes David doesn't just beat Goliath, he gets him arrested, convicted, and sentenced to federal prison. Share your HOA nightmare stories in the comments. Let's support each other in fighting suburban tyranny, and subscribe for more David vs. Goliath stories where justice actually wins. Because next week's episode involves a corrupt city inspector, a building permit scam, and the most epic public records request in municipal history. From all of us here at HOA Justice Stories, thanks for watching today's HOA Tyrant Takedown. If you enjoyed seeing neighbors fight back and karma deliver justice, smash that like button, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe so you won't miss the next HOA drama we bring you.